March 23, 1943, 11,000 feet above the Dutch coast. Oberleutnant Werner Schroer banks his Focke-Wulf 190 left, scanning the scattered formations of B-17 bombers returning from their raid on Wilhelmshaven. He's a 24-year-old veteran with 19 confirmed kills, and he's learned to trust his instincts. Today, those instincts are screaming that something is wrong. A new shape appears at his 2 o'clock position. Not a Spitfire, not a P-38. This aircraft is massive for a single-engine fighter, almost grotesquely large, with a bulbous nose and broad wings. Schroer has seen the intelligence briefings. The Americans have a new fighter, the P-47 Thunderbolt, but Luftwaffe intelligence assures pilots it's essentially a flying truck. Heavy, sluggish, armed like the P-40 Warhawk with just 6 machine guns. Nothing that should concern an experienced pilot in a Focke-Wulf 190. Schroer commits to the attack. He's got altitude advantage, speed advantage, and the confidence of a man who has survived 2 years of aerial combat. The P-47 appears to notice him, begins a gentle turn. Too slow, Schroer thinks. He'll close from the rear quarter, fire a quick burst into the engine or cockpit, and be gone before the American knows what happened. At 400 yards, Schroer settles his gun sight reticle just ahead of the Thunderbolt's nose. At 300 yards, he can see the aircraft clearly now. It's even bigger than he expected, painted in dull olive green, with a white star on the fuselage. At 200 yards, he presses the firing button. His 4 MG-151 cannons and 2 MG-17 machine guns erupt in perfect sequence, sending a stream of 20mm and 7.92mm rounds toward the American fighter. The P-47 rolls hard right, not the laboured, slow manoeuvre Schroer expected, but a crisp, aggressive movement that speaks of power and control. And then the American fighter's wings light up, not from 2 positions, not from 4, from 8 distinct points of flame. Schroer's brain has exactly 1.3 seconds to process this information before his Focke-Wulf shudders like a truck hitting a wall. Holes appear in his left wing root, his canopy cracks. The instrument panel explodes in a shower of glass and sparks. Something hot tears through his left shoulder. He's already throwing his aircraft into a desperate dive, no longer thinking about kills or victory, thinking only about survival and the impossible mathematics of what just happened. 8 guns means 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each firing at approximately 800 rounds per minute. Total combined rate of fire, 6,400 rounds per minute. But the Americans stagger their fire, alternating between gun pairs to maintain barrel life and ammunition conservation. Effective sustained rate in combat, approximately 3,000 rounds per minute. Schroer would later tell his squadron mates that it felt like flying into a metal storm. He was more right than he knew. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt represented a fundamental shift in American fighter doctrine, but that shift was almost invisible to German intelligence analysts working from their headquarters in occupied France. The Luftwaffe's intelligence assessments of American aircraft during early 1943 were based on careful analysis of previous encounters, captured aircraft, and reasonable extrapolation. Every American fighter they'd faced before 1943 followed a predictable pattern. The P-40 Warhawk carried 650 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. The P-39 Airacobra mounted one 37mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns, but the cannon had limited ammunition, and the aircraft itself was mediocre at best. The P-38 Lightning carried one 20mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns, respectable firepower but split between 2 booms, creating convergence issues. 6 guns became the assumed standard for American single-engine fighters. Luftwaffe training materials from January 1943 explicitly stated that American fighters typically carried 6 weapons with approximately 200 to 300 rounds per gun. Total ammunition capacity, 1,200 to 1,800 rounds. At combat firing rates, that translated to roughly 45 to 60 seconds of trigger time before the American fighter went Winchester, pilot slang for out of ammunition. German tactical doctrine evolved around this assumption. If you could survive the initial American attack, force them to burn ammunition through evasive maneuvers, you could outlast them. German fighters typically carried less ammunition, but fired heavier caliber weapons. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G carried one 20mm cannon with 150 rounds and two 13mm machine guns with 300 rounds each. The Focke-Wulf 190A carried four 20mm cannons with approximately 175 rounds per gun and two 13mm machine guns. These weapons hit harder per shot. One 20mm high-explosive round could destroy a bomber's engine. 3 or 4 hits could bring down a fighter. German pilots were trained to make every shot count, to close within 200 meters before firing, to aim carefully rather than spray bullets. Quality over quantity, precision over volume. This doctrine worked against British Spitfires and American P-40s. It had worked for 3 years. And then the P-47 arrived in England in December 1942, assigned to the 56th Fighter Group at Kingscliff and the 4th Fighter Group at Debden. The aircraft itself was controversial even among American pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, called it a 7-ton monster when he first saw it. The P-47 weighed 13,200 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire Mark V. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine, 18 cylinders, producing 2,000 horsepower at takeoff power, 2,300 horsepower with water injection for combat emergencies. The engine alone weighed 2,400 pounds. The turbo supercharger system, mounted in the rear fuselage, added another 600 pounds. All this weight was necessary because Republic Aircraft had designed the P-47 around a specific requirement from the Army Air Forces. Maximum performance at high altitude while maintaining heavy armament and armor, protection. The armament was the defining feature. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each gun was provided with 400 rounds of ammunition for the inboard guns and 350 rounds for the outboard guns. Total ammunition load, 3,400 rounds. At the standard combat rate of fire, a P-47 pilot had approximately 90 seconds of continuous firing time, but no pilot fired continuously. Combat discipline meant firing in controlled bursts of 1 to 3 seconds. The 8 guns firing together consumed approximately 150 rounds per second. A 2-second burst put 300 rounds into the target area. 3 2-second bursts, and you'd delivered 900 rounds, more total firepower than a P-40 could shoot in its entire ammunition load. The installation was elegant from an engineering perspective. The guns were staggered in each wing panel, offset vertically to fit within the wings' thickness. The inboard guns were mounted almost directly in front of the pilot, the outboard guns positioned near the wing fold line. All 8 guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards, creating a cone of fire approximately 6 feet in diameter at that range. The Browning M250 caliber was already proven. It fired a bullet weighing 750 grains, that's 1.7 ounces, at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy of each round was approximately 13,000 foot-pounds, enough to penetrate 3/4 of an inch of armor plate at 300 yards. The bullet itself was 51/100ths of an inch in diameter, hence the designation 50 caliber, and measured 2.2 inches long. Standard P-47 ammunition loads mixed armor-piercing incendiary, and tracer rounds in a 4:1:1 ratio. Every 6th round was a tracer, burning bright orange to show the pilot where his bullets were going. The incendiary rounds contained a small charge of white phosphorus that ignited on impact, starting fires in fuel tanks and oil lines. The armor-piercing rounds used a hardened steel core to punch through engine blocks and armor plate. When all 8 guns fired together, they created a sound and visual effect unlike anything previously seen in air combat. Pilots described it as a freight train of lead. Gun camera footage shows the target aircraft literally disintegrating under the impact, wings folding, engines erupting in flame, fuselages breaking apart. But this devastating capability remained largely unknown to Luftwaffe intelligence through the first 3 months of 1943. The first P-47 combat missions occurred in March 1943, short-range escort missions to occupied France and Belgium. The Thunderbolt's initial combat radius was limited by its massive fuel consumption. The big Pratt & Whitney engine burned 150 gallons per hour at cruise power, 250 gallons per hour at combat power. With an internal fuel capacity of 305 gallons, mission time was limited to roughly 2 hours, which translated to combat missions no deeper than 150 miles from base. German pilots who encountered P-47s during these early missions reported them as heavy, well-armed fighters, but the true extent of that armament wasn't immediately clear. Combat happens fast. A pilot being attacked doesn't count muzzle flashes. He reacts, evades, survives if he's lucky. The after-action reports were vague. New American fighter type, good speed at altitude, effective firepower. Luftwaffe intelligence officers compiled these reports and reached conclusions based on established patterns. The Americans had introduced a new fighter. It appeared to be heavily armed, probably with 6 or possibly 8 machine guns, putting it roughly equivalent to a late-model P-40 or perhaps slightly better. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing that required fundamental tactical changes. This assessment was reinforced by physical evidence, or rather, the lack of it. German engineers wanted to examine a captured P-47 to understand its capabilities, but no intact aircraft had been captured. Several P-47s had been shot down over France during March and April, but they crashed into the English Channel or were too damaged for meaningful analysis. One relatively intact aircraft came down near Abbeville on April 8th, but it burned before recovery teams arrived. Without a physical aircraft to examine, intelligence analysts relied on observation and estimation. They watched P-47s from a distance, photographed them when possible, and tried to count weapon installations. But counting gun ports on an aircraft traveling 300 miles per hour at 10,000 feet is difficult. Photographs showed dark oval openings in the wings, definitely multiple weapons, but exactly how many? The confusion was compounded by German familiarity with their own multi-gun installations. The Focke-Wulf 190A5 carried 6 weapons total, 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. The later A6 model carried 4 cannons and 2 machine guns, or optionally, 2 cannons and 4 machine guns, depending on the field conversion kit installed. 6 weapons was normal. 8 seemed excessive, wasteful of weight and ammunition. German engineering philosophy prioritized efficiency. Why carry 8 lighter weapons when 4 heavier weapons could achieve the same result with less weight, less complexity, and easier maintenance? The MG-151 20mm cannon used in German fighters fired a projectile weighing 4.6 ounces, with a muzzle velocity of 2,550 feet per second. One hit from this weapon delivered approximately the same kinetic energy as 3 or 4 50 caliber hits. From a purely mathematical standpoint, 4 20mm cannons with 700 rounds total were more efficient than 8 50 calibers with 3,400 rounds. The German installation weighed less, required less wing space, and delivered comparable destructive power. This logical analysis led German intelligence to conclude that even if the P-47 did carry 8 guns, which seemed unlikely, it wouldn't represent a revolutionary advancement. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and German pilots were about to learn the difference between theoretical firepower and practical combat effectiveness in the most brutal way possible. The revelation began in earnest during May 1943. When P-47 groups started flying deeper escort missions. The introduction of drop tanks, metal external fuel containers that could be jettisoned when empty, extended the Thunderbolts' range from 150 miles to 250 miles. This brought American fighters into confrontation with Luftwaffe units that had been operating with relative impunity over Belgium and northern France. Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, had been bloodied by Spitfires throughout 1942, but had adapted their tactics. They'd learned to respect the Spitfire's maneuverability while exploiting its weaknesses, limited ammunition and range. German pilots were trained to force extended engagements, make the British burn ammunition through evasive maneuvers, then capitalize when the Spitfires had to break off and return to England. These same tactics failed completely against P-47s. Hauptmann Johannes Seifert, a veteran of Jagdgeschwader 26 with 38 confirmed kills, described his first extended engagement with Thunderbolts on May 14, 1943. His Focke-Wulf 190 had jumped a formation of 4 P-47s near Lille. He expected a quick combat, shoot down 1 or 2 Americans, scatter the formation, return to base. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. During that time, Seifert made 3 separate attack runs on the American formation. Each time, he closed to firing range, got off a brief burst, and was forced to break away as multiple P-47s turned to engage him. And each time they fired, the volume of tracers seemed impossible. Seifert was used to seeing 6 streams of fire from enemy fighters. Against the Thunderbolts, he saw 8 distinct tracer streams from each aircraft, and they didn't stop firing. Long bursts, 3 and 4 seconds, something no pilot with limited ammunition would dare attempt. On his third attack run, Seifert's wingman, Unteroffizier Karl Fischer, took hits. Fischer's aircraft didn't just receive damage. It came apart. The left wing folded upward at a 90-degree angle, the engine cowling separated from the fuselage, and the entire aircraft tumbled out of control. Fischer didn't bail out. He rode the wreckage, down into a forest north of Lille. Seifert broke off the engagement, returned to base, and filed a combat report that his commanding officer initially questioned. 8 guns per aircraft, firing for extended periods, delivering catastrophic damage with short bursts. It seemed exaggerated, the kind of report filed by a pilot trying to excuse the loss of his wingman. But similar reports were arriving from other units. Jagdgeschwader 2, operating from Beaumont-le-Roger, lost 3 aircraft to P-47s during May. Jagdgeschwader 11, recently transferred from Germany to shore up channel defences, lost 5 aircraft in their first week encountering Thunderbolts. The pattern was consistent. German pilots would engage what appeared to be standard American fighters, expect conventional combat dynamics, and encounter firepower that exceeded anything in their experience. The psychological impact was significant. German fighter pilots were trained to be aggressive, to close with enemy aircraft and destroy them with precise fire. But aggression against P-47s resulted in aircraft being destroyed by overwhelming return fire. Caution meant allowing American fighters to escort bombers unmolested. Neither option was acceptable, but one option kept you alive. The truth arrived in pieces, delivered by pilots who survived encounters they shouldn't have survived, and by intelligence officers who finally had physical evidence to examine. The breakthrough came on June 12, 1943. When First Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group crash-landed his P-47 near the German-occupied airfield at Evreux after a running battle with Focke-Wulf 190s. Johnson had taken multiple cannon hits. His aircraft was barely flyable, hydraulics destroyed, engine damaged, but he managed to set it down in a field 3 miles from the airfield. German troops reached the wreckage within 20 minutes. Johnson had already been taken prisoner by Wehrmacht infantry, but his aircraft remained largely intact. For the first time, Luftwaffe engineers had access to a complete P-47. The examination team arrived from Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility, within 48 hours. What they documented transformed German understanding of American fighter capability. The aircraft's weight astonished them, 13,200 pounds combat loaded. For comparison, A Messerschmitt Bf-109G weighed 6,700 pounds, and a Focke-Wulf 190A weighed 8,900 pounds. The American fighter was 50% heavier than anything the Luftwaffe flew, but the weight was purposeful. The engineers found armor plate everywhere. Behind the pilot's seat, 3/8 of an inch of face-hardened steel. Under the pilot's seat, 1/4 inch steel. Around the engine oil tank, 3/8 inch steel. Behind the engine, a thick armored firewall. In front of the pilot, layered bulletproof, glass 1.4 inches thick total. The cockpit was a fortress. Then they examined the wings. The engineering report, filed as Rechlin document number R34/43, describes 8 Browning M2 machine guns mounted in staggered formation. Inboard guns positioned at wing root, with 400 rounds per gun, fed from ammunition boxes mounted vertically. Outboard guns at mid-wing with 350 rounds per gun. Total rounds carried, 3,400. The German engineers test-weighed the ammunition. 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition weighed approximately 530 pounds. The 8 guns themselves weighed approximately 480 pounds. The ammunition feed systems, heating elements to prevent freezing at altitude, and mounting structures added another 200 pounds. Total weight dedicated solely to armament, 1,210 pounds. The report noted this exceeded the entire empty weight of a Messerschmitt Bf-109's armament, ammunition, and engine combined. The Americans had built a fighter that carried more firepower as a secondary system than most German fighters weighed fully equipped. The psychological implications were carefully documented. Rechlin engineers concluded that any pilot engaging this aircraft from the forward hemisphere would face combined firepower equivalent to approximately 50 rounds per second, striking a target area 6 feet in diameter. The technical analysis was forwarded to Luftwaffe High Command with a priority classification. Oberst Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, read the report on June 19th and immediately ordered tactical revisions. A directive issued on June 22, 1943, redesignated the P-47 as a primary threat, requiring specialized engagement protocols. The directive was explicit. Avoid head-on attacks against P-47 formations. The combined firepower of 4 American fighters firing directly forward exceeded that of an entire German squadron. If engagement was necessary, attack from the rear hemisphere, where only the tail guns, if present, could return fire. Actually, P-47s had no tail guns, but German intelligence wasn't certain of this yet. Use superior rate of climb and acceleration to execute boom and zoom attacks. The P-47 was fast in level flight and could dive extraordinarily well due to its weight, but it climbed slowly when loaded. German fighters should exploit altitude advantage, dive through American formations, fire a quick burst, and zoom back to altitude before the Thunderbolts could respond. Never engage in extended turning fights. The P-47's ammunition capacity allowed it to sustain fire for 90 seconds of trigger time. German fighters carried enough ammunition for perhaps 30 seconds of firing. If a P-47 pilot forced a turning engagement, he could simply wait for the German fighter to exhaust its ammunition, then destroy it at leisure. These tactical revisions were sound in theory. In practice, they required discipline and patience that contradicted 3 years of Luftwaffe training. German fighter pilots had been taught aggressive tactics, close with the enemy, destroy him decisively, move to the next target. The new directive essentially told them to hit and run, to avoid prolonged combat, to behave like the cautious rather than the predator. Some pilots adapted, others didn't, or couldn't. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Sturm of Jagdgeschwader 54 had 26 confirmed kills when he encountered P-47s on July 4, 1943, over the Dutch coast. Sturm was leading a Schwarm, a 4-aircraft tactical formation, assigned to intercept B-17s returning from a raid on Le Mans. He spotted 6 P-47s at his altitude, 11,000 feet, escorting the bombers. Standard doctrine said, avoid engagement, shadow the formation, report position and strength to headquarters. Sturm's combat record said attack. He was an experienced pilot, confident in his abilities and his aircraft. 6 American fighters meant 6 potential kills. He positioned his swarm for a classic coordinated attack, 2 aircraft engaging from high right, 2 from high left, converging on the American formation simultaneously. The attack began at 09:43 hours. Sturm's diving speed exceeded 400 miles per hour as he closed on the trailing P-47. His gun sight tracked perfectly, the American aircraft centered in the reticle. At 300 meters, Sturm fired. His 4 MG-151 cannons hammered out 60 rounds in a 3-second burst. He saw hits sparking on the P-47's left wing and fuselage. The American fighter rolled right, trailing some smoke but remaining airborne. Then all 6 P-47s turned into the attack. Not a defensive break, not an evasive maneuver. An aggressive counterattack with all 6 aircraft firing simultaneously. 48 machine guns delivering approximately 400 rounds per second created a visible wall of tracers. Sturm's wingman, Feldwebel Otto Becker, flew directly into this fire stream. His Focke-Wulf 190 exploded. Not caught fire, not crashed, exploded. One moment it was an aircraft. The next it was fragments tumbling through the air. Sturm broke hard left, pulling maximum G-force, feeling the blood drain from his head as his vision narrowed to a tunnel. He heard cannon hits striking his aircraft, felt the fighter shudder, saw his right-wing outer panel tear away completely. His Focke-Wulf went into an uncontrolled spin. He managed to bail out at 7,000 feet, deployed his parachute, and watched his aircraft cartwheel into the ground near Vlissingen. 2 other members of his swarm were shot down during the same engagement. Only 1 German pilot survived. The 6 P-47s returned to base at Manston without losses. American pilots reported encountering aggressive German fighters and engaging them successfully. Standard combat report, nothing exceptional from their perspective. For Sturm, who spent the rest of the war in a British POW camp, the engagement represented a brutal education. He'd attacked what he thought were conventionally armed American fighters and encountered firepower that destroyed 3 German aircraft in less than 2 minutes. Years after the war, Sturm was interviewed for a Luftwaffe Veterans Association publication. His description was bitter and precise. We were told they carried 6 guns. We based our tactics on this assumption. When I attacked, I saw 8 guns firing from each aircraft. 8. The volume of fire was unbelievable. My wingman flew through their tracers for perhaps 2 seconds before his aircraft disintegrated. 2 seconds. I had been in combat for 2 years and never saw an aircraft destroyed that quickly. The summer of 1943 became a present learning period written in German casualties. Jagdgeschwader 1, operating from Diemen in the Netherlands, lost 18 aircraft to P-47s during July and August. Jagdgeschwader 11 lost 23. These weren't rookie pilots making mistakes. These were experienced combat veterans with kill scores ranging from 5 to 30 aircraft, men who understood aerial combat and had survived hundreds of engagements. The problem was institutional. German fighter training emphasized individual skill and aggressive tactics. Pilots were taught to trust their instincts, close with the enemy, and fight decisively. These instincts, honed against British Hurricanes and Spitfires, became liabilities against Thunderbolts. The Spitfire carried 8 machine guns. True, but they were 303 caliber, smaller and less powerful than the American 50 caliber. A German pilot could absorb some hits from 303 seconds and remain combat effective. Hits from 50 caliber rounds destroyed aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Major Gunther Rahl, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces with 275 confirmed kills, encountered P-47s, for the first time in August 1943 after transferring from the Eastern Front to Germany for home defense duties. Rahl had spent 2 years fighting Soviet aircraft, mostly older models like the I-16 and La-GG-3, fighters with lighter armament and less rugged construction. His tactics were refined through hundreds of combat missions: close rapidly, fire precisely, kill efficiently. His first engagement with P-47s occurred on August 17, 1943, the same day as the disastrous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. Rahl was flying a Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6, leading a Staffel squadron of 12 aircraft assigned to intercept bombers near Bonn. They encountered P-47s from the 352nd Fighter Group at 24,000 feet. Rahl initiated a textbook attack, diving from altitude, selecting a P-47 that had separated slightly from its formation. He closed to 200 meters, a range where his 20mm cannon could devastate any aircraft. He fired a 2-second burst, saw strikes on the American fighter's fuselage and wing root. The P-47 immediately rolled inverted and dived vertically, streaming coolant vapor. Rahl followed, expecting to confirm the kill. The P-47 pulled out of the dive at 12,000 feet, rolled upright, and turned back toward Rahl's Messerschmitt. Still flying, still fighting. Impossible, Rahl thought. He'd seen his cannon strikes hit home. The aircraft should be crippled or destroyed. Instead, it was maneuvering aggressively with all 8 guns firing. Rahl broke off the engagement. Not from fear, but from professional assessment. His ammunition state was already depleted from the first attack. The American fighter was clearly damaged but remained combat-capable, suggesting armor protection beyond anything Rahl had encountered in Soviet aircraft. Continuing the fight meant risking his aircraft against an opponent who could sustain more damage and fire longer. The P-47's armor had indeed saved it. The pilot, Second Lieutenant Quince Brown of the 352nd Fighter Group, took hits in the wing, fuselage, and engine cowling. 17 separate impacts from 20mm cannon shells and machine gun rounds. But the engine kept running, protected by the massive bulk of the Pratt & Whitney radial and its cooling system. The armor plate behind Brown's seat stopped fragments. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. Brown flew his damaged aircraft back to England, landed at Manston, and walked away with minor scratches. The contrast between German and American fighter philosophy became starkly apparent through incidents like this. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 weighed 6,700 pounds and prioritized performance. Climb rate, maximum speed, and maneuverability were paramount. Armor protection was minimal. Pilot armor consisted of a single plate behind the seat, half an inch thick. Fuel tanks were self-sealing but small and vulnerable. A direct hit from a .50 caliber round often resulted in catastrophic damage. The P-47 weighed 13,200 pounds and prioritized survivability. The designers assumed the aircraft would take hits and built accordingly. Republic Aviation's engineering philosophy was simple: protect the pilot, protect critical systems, accept the weight penalty, and compensate with engine power. The massive Pratt & Whitney radial provided enough horsepower to move all that weight at competitive speeds. This design philosophy created aircraft that could absorb punishment and keep fighting. Combat reports from the summer and fall of 1943 document P-47s returning to base, with damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. One aircraft from the 56th Fighter Group landed at Halesworth on September 9th, with 47 separate combat damage holes, including a 20mm cannon strike that penetrated the cockpit and destroyed the instrument panel. The pilot, Captain Walker Mahurin, flew the aircraft home on instinct and basic flight controls, landed safely, and flew another mission 2 days later. German pilots found this incomprehensible. Their experience fighting Soviet and British aircraft taught them that successful hits produced results. Flames, smoke, structural failure, loss of control. Against Thunderbolts, successful hits often produced nothing but cosmetic damage and an angry American pilot who returned fire with 8 machine guns. The psychological impact accumulated through repeated engagements. Young German pilots arriving at operational squadrons in late 1943 received warnings from veterans. Avoid the big American fighters with radial engines. Don't engage them from the front. If you hit one and it doesn't go down immediately, break off and escape. These warnings contradicted official doctrine and undermined confidence. Lieutenant Franz Stiegler, a pilot with WWII 27, described the mental challenge in his post-war memoir. "We were taught to be aggressive, to attack decisively. But against the American heavyweights, aggression often meant death. You had to think differently, act differently. It felt like cowardice, even though it was survival." The Luftwaffe attempted to counter P-47 firepower through tactical innovation and weapon upgrades. Some units experimented with standoff attacks using 21-centimeter rockets, large unguided projectiles, fired from underwing tubes at bomber formations. The rockets were inaccurate but psychologically intimidating, and allowed German fighters to attack from beyond effective machine gun range. Other units upgraded to heavier weapons. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G6/R6 variant carried 3 30mm Mk108 cannons, 1 firing through the propeller hub and 2 in underwing gondolas. The 30mm round weighed 1 pound and contained approximately 3 ounces of high explosive. 1 hit could destroy a bomber's engine. 2 hits could break a fighter in half. But the heavier weapons came with penalties. The underwing cannon gondolas added weight and drag, reducing climb rate and maneuverability. The Mk108's low muzzle velocity, just 1,700 feet per second, meant bullets dropped significantly over distance, making accurate shooting difficult. And the ammunition capacity was limited. The Mk108 carried just 60 rounds per gun, at a firing rate of 600 rounds per minute, that translated to 6 seconds of firing time total. German pilots, equipped with these upgraded fighters, found themselves in a paradox. They carried weapons powerful enough to destroy American bombers with 1 or 2 hits, but couldn't survive long enough to get those hits. P-47s escorting the bombers would engage German fighters during their attack runs, forcing them to jettison their bombs or rockets and fight defensively. The heavier weapons made the German fighters slower and less maneuverable, easier targets for American pilots who had 90 seconds of ammunition and could afford to fire freely. Major Johannes Steinhoff, commanding officer of WWII 77, analyzed this problem in an October 1943 report to Luftwaffe High Command. His conclusion was stark. "We cannot match American firepower through weapon upgrades alone. Their fighters carry more ammunition, fire longer, and absorb more damage. Our tactical advantage lies in altitude performance and initial acceleration. If we abandon these advantages by adding weight, we create aircraft that cannot compete." Steinhoff's recommendation was to maintain lighter weapon fits and emphasize tactical discipline. Attack bombers only when fighter escort was absent or distracted. Avoid prolonged engagements with P-47s. Use speed and climb rate to dictate combat terms. Disengage when ammunition ran low rather than continue fighting. These tactics worked when executed perfectly by experienced pilots, but they required patience and discipline under stress, qualities that eroded as the war continued, and veteran pilots were killed or transferred. New pilots arriving at operational squadrons in late 1943 had less training time than their predecessors. In 1940, a German fighter pilot received approximately 240 hours of flight training before entering combat. By late 1943, training had been reduced to 160 hours, and fuel shortages meant much of that training was on gliders or light aircraft rather than actual fighters. These inadequately trained pilots faced veteran American fighter groups flying aircraft with overwhelming firepower advantages. The mathematics were brutal. A novice German pilot with 30 hours in type flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109 with 6 seconds of cannon ammunition, engaging an American pilot with 100 hours in type, flying a P-47 with 90 seconds of ammunition. The German pilot needed to close within 200 meters, achieve a perfect firing solution, and land hits with his brief burst. The American pilot could fire from 400 meters, sustain fire for extended periods, and accept misses because he had ammunition to spare. The casualty rates reflected this disparity. During the last 3 months of 1943, Luftwaffe day fighter units in the West lost 411 aircraft destroyed and 197 damaged beyond immediate repair. Pilot casualties were 307 killed or missing, 143 wounded seriously enough to be removed from flight status. These losses included 64 pilots with more than 20 confirmed kills, experienced men whose combat knowledge died with them. The 8th Air Force, meanwhile, lost 192 P-47s during the same period. Some to German fighters, some to flak, some to mechanical failures or accidents. But the loss rate per sortie flown was declining. In July, P-47 groups lost approximately 1 aircraft per 100 sorties. By December, that rate had dropped to 0.6 per 100 sorties. American pilots were learning how to use their aircraft's strengths. German pilots were dying before they could learn to counter them. The strategic implications extended beyond individual engagements. The P-47's arrival meant American bombers could penetrate deeper into German territory with effective fighter escort. Prior to March 1943, heavy bombers attacking targets beyond 300 miles from England flew without escort. Luftwaffe fighters savaged these unescorted formations. The introduction of P-47s with drop tanks extended fighter coverage to 450 miles by December 1943. This range included most of Western Germany, major industrial centers in the Ruhr Valley, and critical facilities like ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. German fighters that attempted to intercept these formations had to fight through multiple layers of P-47 escorts before reaching the bombers. The combat math became unsustainable. To destroy a single B-17 required multiple coordinated attacks by several German fighters. But reaching that B-17 meant surviving encounters with 8 to 12 P-47s, each carrying enough firepower to destroy 2 or 3 German fighters if properly employed. Even successful interceptions that destroyed several bombers often cost the Luftwaffe more fighters than they could afford to lose. By early 1944, the strategic balance had shifted decisively. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang with its exceptional range would complete the transformation, but the P-47 had already broken German fighter defenses. Luftwaffe units that had operated with relative impunity over occupied Europe through 1942 found themselves desperately defending German airspace against bombers escorted by fighters they couldn't effectively counter. The final confirmation of the P-47's impact came from German industrial analysis. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, examined German production records and operational reports. The data showed fighter production actually increased through 1944, from approximately 1,000 fighters per month in January to over 3,000 per month by September. But operational strength declined. The Luftwaffe was losing fighters faster than production could replace them, and more critically, losing pilots far faster than training programs could replace them. By May 1944, the average Luftwaffe day fighter pilot had 60 hours total flight time. Average P-47 pilot flight time exceeded 140 hours. The experience gap, combined with the massive firepower and durability advantages American fighters enjoyed, created a situation where German fighter effectiveness collapsed even as numerical strength increased. The 850 caliber machine guns that Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed as excessive or unlikely in early 1943 became the standard against which all future fighter armament was measured. Post-war American fighter designs retained the 8-gun layout through the F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet. The principle remained valid. Overwhelming firepower allows less experienced pilots to achieve results that precision shooting requires. Modern air combat has moved beyond gun armament to missile systems, but the underlying philosophy persists. The 15 Eagle carries 8 air-to-air missiles. The F-22 Raptor carries 6 to 8 missiles depending on configuration. Volume of fire remains a decisive advantage. Technology changed the delivery system from bullets to guided missiles, but the mathematics are unchanged. The museum at the National Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, houses a P-47D, one of the later production models with increased range and refined systems. The placard describes it as one of the most successful fighter aircraft of World War II. Visitors can walk beneath the wings and see the 8 gun ports, dark openings spaced along the leading edge. Most people don't grasp the significance. 8 holes in a wing. What's the big deal? The significance is that those 8 holes represented a firepower advantage so overwhelming that experienced German pilots with years of combat experience chose to avoid engagement rather than risk battle. The significance is that teenage American pilots, some with less than 1 year of total flight time, could defeat veteran Luftwaffe aces because their aircraft could absorb punishment and deal it back in volumes the Germans couldn't match. Werner Schroer, the pilot who opened this story, survived the war with 114 confirmed kills, making him one of Germany's highest-scoring aces. In a 1956 interview with aviation historians, he was asked about his most difficult opponent. He didn't mention British Spitfires or Soviet Yaks. He said the American Thunderbolt was the only fighter that consistently made him question whether attacking was worth the risk. You could defeat a Spitfire if you were skilled and careful, Schroer explained. You could defeat any German or Russian fighter through superior tactics, but against the Thunderbolt, skill wasn't enough. They could make mistakes and survive because their aircraft protected them. They could fire freely while we had to conserve ammunition. They could absorb our hits while our aircraft came apart from their hits. It wasn't fighting an equal opponent. It was fighting an opponent with every advantage. That assessment, from a man who spent 5 years in aerial combat and survived when most of his contemporaries died, represents the ultimate vindication of Republic Aviation's design philosophy. The P-47 wasn't the fastest fighter. The Spitfire Mark 14 was faster. It wasn't the most maneuverable. The Japanese Zero could outturn it easily. It wasn't the longest ranged. The P-51 Mustang flew further. But it carried 850 caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds of ammunition, armor protection that kept pilots alive, and structural strength that brought damaged aircraft home. These characteristics made it the fighter that broke the Luftwaffe's back over Western Europe during 1943 and early 1944. When historians analyze the turning point in the European Air War, they often cite the introduction of drop tanks or the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, but the real turning point came earlier, when the first P-47s arrived over France in March 1943, and German pilots discovered that everything they knew about American fighter armament was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The kind of wrong that gets you killed before you can learn better. The transformation in American bomber loss rates tells the story in numbers that need no interpretation. January 1943, before P-47 escort became common, bomber loss rates averaged 6.3% per mission. By December 1943, with P-47 groups providing deep escort, loss rates had dropped to 2.1%. The bombers themselves hadn't changed. The German defences hadn't weakened. What changed was the presence of POLT, escorts carrying enough firepower to make German fighters reconsider every engagement. 8 guns, 3,000 rounds per minute combined fire rate, 90 seconds of trigger time. These weren't just technical specifications. They were the difference between a bomber crew completing their tour and dying over Germany. They were the difference between German fighters controlling their own airspace and being hunted over their own territory. They were the difference between theoretical firepower and overwhelming combat superiority. The young men who flew P-47s into combat during 1943 and 44 didn't fully understand the advantage they held. They knew their aircraft was tough and well-armed, but they couldn't know what German pilots felt when 8 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. They couldn't know that veteran Luftwaffe pilots warned rookies to avoid the big American radial fighters. They couldn't know that their presence alone forced tactical changes throughout the German fighter force. They just knew they could press the trigger and make enemy fighters disappear in a storm of 50 caliber fire. They knew they could take hits and keep flying. They knew they brought their bombers home. That was enough. The Luftwaffe never adequately solved the P-47 problem. They tried heavier armament, better tactics, more experienced pilots concentrated in elite units. Nothing worked consistently. The mathematical advantages were too great. By the time German engineers developed jet fighters that could match or exceed Thunderbolt performance, it was too late. The air war was already lost, decided by conventional piston engine fighters with 8 machine guns and the will to use them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.